America's most deadly war isn't fought overseas. It's fought in quiet towns, in bedrooms, in parking lots. Every 5 minutes, someone in the United States dies from an opioid overdose. It's a crisis that's claimed more lives than every American war since Vietnam combined. But this isn't a story of street dealers or addicts. It's a story of corporations, politics, and the deliberate creation of dependence. Our story begins not with fentanyl, but with pain. In the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies saw an opportunity. For decades, doctors had been cautious about prescribing opioids, knowing their addictive potential. Then came a new promise, a miracle drug for pain that supposedly carried almost no risk of addiction. That drug was OxyContin, and the company behind it was Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family. Purdue's marketing blitz was revolutionary and catastrophic. They sent representatives across the country, telling doctors that OxyContin was safe. They funded medical journals, sponsored conferences, and even produced pamphlets, claiming less than 1% of patients became addicted. But that statistic was a lie, one pulled from a single outdated hospital report. The truth was far darker. By the early 2000s, millions of Americans were addicted, not to street heroin, but to pills handed to them by their doctors. Pain clinics became pill mills. Entire communities, especially in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, were flooded with bottles of OxyContin. For some small towns, the number of prescriptions exceeded the population. The result? A generation of Americans chemically shackled to a drug they were told was harmless. When regulators finally cracked down, people already hooked on opioids didn't stop. They switched. Heroin, cheaper and easier to find, filled the void. Then came the third and deadliest wave, fentanyl, a synthetic opioid 50 times stronger than heroin and easy to mass produce. But who was making it, and how did it become the #1 killer in America?
As America tried to pull itself out of one crisis, another, far deadlier one began to seep through its borders. By the mid-2000s, fentanyl had become the new face of the opioid epidemic. Invisible, unstoppable, and unlike anything the world had seen before. It wasn't grown in poppy fields or smuggled in bricks. It was made in labs. Fentanyl's origins trace back to the 1960s, when it was first synthesized by Belgian chemist Dr. Paul Janssen. In hospitals, it was a legitimate medicine, used for surgeries and severe pain. But in the hands of traffickers, it became a weapon. A single teaspoon could kill thousands, and because it was so powerful, it was easy to smuggle. A few grams could replace an entire shipment of heroin. The new supply chain began with chemical precursors manufactured in China. Through online sales and dark web markets, small labs sold raw materials to Mexican cartels, who began producing fentanyl on an industrial scale. They pressed it into counterfeit pills, fake OxyContin, fake Xanax, fake Adderall, and flooded the US market. To the untrained eye, these pills looked identical to pharmacy-grade medication, but inside each one was a lethal gamble, sometimes enough fentanyl to kill in a single dose. In states like Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, overdoses skyrocketed. Families who had already lost loved ones to OxyContin were now losing children to fentanyl-laced pills. Dealers didn't even need intent. A microscopic error in measurement could turn a sale into a murder. And because fentanyl was so profitable, there was no going back. It was now at the heart of the global drug trade. Law enforcement scrambled to respond, but they were outmatched. Fentanyl was small, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. Customs agents could seize a shipment at one port, only for 10 more to arrive by mail the next day. Meanwhile, cartels used legitimate logistics systems, trucking companies, ports, even commercial flights, to hide their supply lines. The crisis became Hydra-headed. Cut off one path and 2 more would appear. By 2017, the numbers were staggering. Over 70,000 Americans dead in a single year. That's more than died in the entire Vietnam War. Fentanyl wasn't just a drug, it was a contagion of despair. It touched everyone. As fentanyl deaths surged across the country, America's political establishment seemed frozen in time, talking about tough on crime instead of confronting the real crisis. For years, the government's response had been shaped not by science or compassion, but by profit and politics. At the root of this failure was the pharmaceutical lobby, the same industry that fueled the opioid epidemic in the first place. Companies like Purdue Pharma, McKesson, and Cardinal Health spent hundreds of millions lobbying Congress to weaken oversight. While millions of prescriptions flooded poor towns and small cities, regulators looked the other way. The Drug Enforcement Administration, once feared by traffickers, became entangled in bureaucracy and political pressure. Even after internal DEA whistleblowers sounded alarms about suspicious shipments, corporate lawyers and political donations buried the reports. In 2016, Congress passed the Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act, a bill that made it harder for the DEA to freeze suspicious narcotic shipments. It was sold as a reform, but in reality, it handcuffed enforcement. The bill's sponsors, many of whom had received campaign money from Big Pharma, later admitted they hadn't understood its consequences. By the time the damage was clear, overdose deaths had doubled. Meanwhile, the rhetoric in Washington turned the crisis into a political talking point. Conservatives blamed open borders. Liberals pointed to corporate greed. Both were right, and both were missing the point. This wasn't just a border problem or a corporate scandal. It was the collapse of a system that valued profit over people. Behind every overdose statistic was a pattern. A worker who'd lost their job, a veteran dealing with trauma, a teen numbing anxiety. But instead of investing in treatment, America built prisons. Instead of treating addiction as a disease, it declared another war on drugs, a war it had already lost decades ago. Fentanyl was the logical conclusion of that failure, faster, deadlier, and unstoppable. The cartels didn't need to innovate. America had already created the demand, and in a cruel twist, US pharmaceutical companies and Chinese chemical exporters both found themselves part of the same deadly supply chain. One fed the legal addiction, the other supplied its cheaper, illicit replacement. By the end of the 2010s, the fentanyl crisis had become the largest mass poisoning in American history. Every 5 minutes, someone died of an overdose. And yet Wall Street soared. Corporations settled lawsuits with pocket change, and lawmakers continued to argue, while families buried their children. But what's next? What happens when the death toll keeps rising and a generation grows up surrounded by loss and addiction? In the next section, we'll explore the cultural and social collapse born from this epidemic, the rise of Narcan Nation, the normalization of overdose, and the question haunting every American town. Can this country recover? In many American towns, it's no longer shocking to see someone overdosing on the street. In cities from Philadelphia to Portland, the epidemic is no longer hidden in dark alleys. It's out in the open. Parks, libraries, bus stops. These have become the new front lines of a quiet civil war. And the enemy isn't a foreign invader, or even the cartel. It's the chemical dependency that seeped into every layer of society. Paramedics now carry Narcan, the overdose reversal spray, like soldiers carry rifles. They revive the same people multiple times in a single week. Police departments call it Narcan Nation, a country so overwhelmed by overdoses that saving lives has become a revolving door of revival and relapse. And it isn't just the poor or unemployed. Suburban families, college students, and blue-collar workers have all fallen into the same cycle. The faces of addiction look just like everyone else. Mothers, fathers, children. In the words of one Ohio firefighter, "We used to get called to fires. Now we just fight death." The cultural toll has been immense. Entire towns have been hollowed out. Small businesses have shuttered. Local schools have lost teachers to overdoses, and social workers are stretched beyond exhaustion. Funeral homes are backed up. The opioid crisis is no longer an epidemic, it's an economy. Billions of dollars flow into treatment centers, pharmaceutical settlements, and black market supply chains. Even death has become commodified. And then there's the emotional fallout. Children growing up surrounded by loss. Entire generations raised without stability or hope. A boy in West Virginia once told a journalist, "I've lost more friends to fentanyl than my grandpa lost in Vietnam." That's not hyperbole. That's the math of modern America. Fentanyl has changed the way we grieve, the way we police, and even the way we talk about morality. Once, addiction carried shame. Now it carries fatigue. People are tired of mourning, tired of trying, tired of believing anyone cares. The crisis isn't just chemical, it's existential. Yet amid the despair, there's resistance. Grassroots organizations, often led by mothers who've lost children, have become the moral conscience of the nation. They hand out Narcan. They set up community clinics. They turn grief into action, because the government still hasn't figured out how. They remind us that this isn't just a story of addiction, it's a story of survival. Because even in the shadow of the deadliest drug in human history, people still fight to live.
The fentanyl crisis is not just a story about drugs. It's a mirror, a reflection of what happens when a nation forgets how to care for its people, when pain becomes profit and despair becomes policy. For decades, the United States exported the image of strength, the world's richest, most advanced nation. But beneath that shine, something corroded. Factories closed, communities broke, and millions turned to pills not for pleasure, but for relief. From poverty, from hopelessness, from pain no one else seemed to notice. And now, that corrosion has come home. Every year, over 100,000 Americans die from overdoses, more than car crashes, more than gun deaths, more than every war since Vietnam combined. Each death is a quiet collapse of a family, a story that never finishes, a seat left empty at the table. The numbers are staggering, but they don't tell the real story, the loneliness, the stigma, the system that allowed this to happen. Because the fentanyl crisis didn't begin in a lab in China or a field in Mexico. It began in boardrooms. It began when executives at Purdue Pharma pushed OxyContin into small towns, knowing exactly what it would do. It began when politicians chose campaign donations over treatment funding. It began when a country decided that profit mattered more than people. And yet, this story isn't only about death, it's also about what comes next. In small towns across America, there are signs of resistance, communities opening harm reduction centers, doctors learning new approaches to pain management, and families refusing to be silent. Former addicts are becoming counselors, turning their recovery into a map for others to follow. Faith groups, non-profits, and everyday citizens are building what government failed to: compassion, one life at a time. It's slow, it's fragile, but it's real. Still, the question remains, will America remember this lesson? Or will it bury the crisis like it did the others, meth, crack, heroin, until the next one comes? Because the real epidemic isn't fentanyl, it's forgetting. Forgetting that addiction is not a crime, but an illness. Forgetting that every overdose is preventable. Forgetting that the people we lose aren't statistics, they're us. If there's one truth left in this story, it's this: every nation is defined not by how it prospers, but by how it mourns. And right now, America is mourning loudly. The question is whether it's ready to finally listen.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more deep dives into the world's incredible histories.